Good afternoon. My name is Dr. William Samonides, and I've been asked to speak today because of a book that my wife and I produced in 2009 entitled Greeks of Stark County. One of the 4 chapters of the book is devoted to the history of the Greek community in Maslin and the St. George Greek Orthodox Church there. The cover shows some of the staff of the Sugar Bowl, which for many years was a Greek-owned and operated confectionery on Lincoln Way East in downtown Maslin. The chapter in the book that's devoted to Maslin is probably the most detailed history of the Maslin Greek community that's ever been produced. And for stories of the dozens of members of the Greek community, I recommend that you take a look at this volume that's available online through the publisher Arcadia Publishing in Charleston, South Carolina. I will not today be repeating the material that is there. Instead, I want to focus on the events and circumstances that led to the formation of the Greek church and community in Maslin. Most Greeks are adherents to the Eastern or Greek Orthodox Church, and whenever a Greek community abroad achieved a sufficient size, a church was formed. The church did not simply satisfy the spiritual needs of the community, but it filled an important social, cultural, educational, and recreational function for the Greek communities. In addition, the churches were important in attracting women to the community, and as we'll see, the Greek community in Maslin, as most communities in America, were in need of women to sustain themselves. Greek men often married non-Greek or non-Orthodox women, but when that happened, invariably they left the church, they left the community, and they joined her community. I've divided the formation of the Maslin Greek community into 5 stages. And for the community in Maslin, timing and location were important to its creation and development. The first stage is initial settlement and chain migration, and that occurred in the early years of the 20th century. The second stage was the establishment of small businesses, and that's roughly around 1910. Third stage was a second major influx of immigrants from Asia Minor, modern Turkey, around 1912, 1913. The fourth stage, outbreak of World War I in 1914, and the final stage in April 1931 was the establishment of St. George, the Greek Orthodox Church. I'll be going into detail on all these as we proceed. Before the 1890s, Greek immigration to America was negligible. Mostly seamen and merchants who settled in the major coastal cities from northeast to northwest: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Pensacola, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, Galveston, Texas, San Francisco, and Seattle. Greece has always occupied the rocky peninsula of the Balkans, which could never support a large population because of the scarcity of arable land. As a result, migration to other lands has always been an important outlet for this excess population. Like the Jews, Armenians, Chinese, and Indians, the Greeks have since ancient times been a people of the diaspora, a Greek term meaning to sow or to scatter. As you can see in this map, most of the early scattering of the Greek population was around the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The population in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, is something that will come to impact the Maslin community in later days. When and why did large-scale Greek immigration begin in America? It really didn't begin until in earnest until the last decade of the 19th century, the 1890s, and this was due to a double crisis. One was the inability of Greece to pay its foreign debt obligations, and the second was the collapse of the market for currants. And currants are a type of grape, and at this time in the late 19th century, Greece was a banana republic. It was a one-crop economy with most of the population engaged in agriculture. The current crop was important in the production of French wine. And before the 1890s, the French domestic current production was devastated by a blight. The Greeks rushed in to fill that. They were quite prosperous for a while and very happy, but then the French domestic production was restored and Greece was absolutely devastated. They lost all of their exports, and with that, the money needed to pay off their foreign debt. We've seen a repeat of the collapse of the Greek economy in recent times, in the last decade. At that time, when the Greek economy collapsed, most of the Greek population migrated to Europe, which was the growth area. In the 1890s, it was to America, which was just beginning its real significant industrialization. Politicians always encouraged migration from Greece to reduce unemployment, to keep the excess rural population from flooding and overwhelming the Greek cities, and to bring in money from abroad. The remittances from the Greek workers overseas was vitally important to the economy of Greece as a source of foreign revenue for the cash-strapped nation. Now, it just so happens that this migration from Greece to America coincided with the building of Ellis Island, which opened January 1st, 1892. Before the building of Ellis Island, migration or immigration to America was handled by each state through the ports that accepted immigrants. And with the building of Ellis Island, the federal government took control of immigration, and as a result, New York City became the center of Greek settlement in America. Well, when and why did Greeks cross the ocean and come to a small inland city like Maslin, Ohio? The origins of the Greek community in Maslin are obscure, but one thing is for sure is that the early Greek immigrants knew absolutely nothing about Stark County and about Maslin. Well, how did they learn about this area? And Maslin was fortunately situated along the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which connected the two major Greek centers of settlement, Chicago and New York City. And this map shows you the route of the Pennsylvania Railroad through Stark County, and one can be certain that Greeks going from New York to Chicago were passing through an area that was the picture of prosperity. Lots and lots of new factories and mills were opening along the railroad from Alliance to Maslin, and it probably attracted some early settlers who changed their plans. Instead of going to Chicago, stopped off here. And the railroad was vitally important because at the time there were very few automobiles, certainly no inner-city buses, and more importantly, there were very few good roads connecting cities. So the railroad was the way to come to Maslin, and this is just a later photo of the mills in Maslin that the riders along the Pennsylvania Railroad would have seen. But the Maslin train station, which still exists but in a reduced form from this photo, was the Ellis Island of Greeks coming into Maslin. Well, who came to Maslin? The early Greek immigrants were invariably unskilled laborers who worked as dishwashers or mill hands. Overwhelmingly, they were younger men who could do heavy manual labor. And all of them came from mainland Greece at this time. They were also men of conscription age, so that a number of them came to America to avoid military service. Now, the sick, the old, and the infirmed, whom immigration officials were afraid would become public charges, were not among these early immigrants, and they were not allowed, generally speaking, not allowed to enter America. Almost all of these early immigrants planned to stay short-term and return home with their accumulated savings. External forces intervened, and many changed their plans. Many of these early immigrants lived in crowded, unhealthy, even squalid accommodations to maximize their savings from the meager pay that they received. Often these savings were sent home to provide dowries for their sisters. Stark County was one of the fastest growing sections in one of the fastest growing states in the country at this time, and later on the mills produced high-tech alloy steel, which was the equivalent of Stark County being kind of the Silicon Valley of its time. And the new mills needed all of the labor that the immigrants could provide, and the manpower was quickly absorbed, and the immigrants flocked there. The early immigrants would then send letters home to friends, neighbors, family, extolling the virtues of life in Maslin, and the chain migration was underway. Later, advertisements in Greek language newspapers would promote and sing the praises of Maslin and Stark County, and it encouraged Greeks who were already in America to relocate to this area. Well, among these early immigrants, some of them with an entrepreneurial inclination would use their accumulated savings to establish small businesses that provided services for their fellow immigrants in this male-dominated community. The later immigrants who came off the trains would be greeted around the train stations by Greek-owned and operated coffee shops, restaurants, hotels, confectionaries, pool halls, grocery stores, barbershops, tailors, and tobacco stores. And here are just a few examples of those businesses. You can see here on the left-hand side, there's the counters for tobacco, and on the right-hand side, the shoe shine. Here is a combination grocery store and confectionery, as you can see there on the window. Barbershops were a popular place for socializing and exchanging stories, and of course discussing politics, which is the Greeks' favorite sport, as were the coffee shops. A second major influx of immigrants came from Asia Minor, and it peaked in the years 1912, 1913. That's a distinctive feature of the Greek community in Maslin and actually Stark County. Greeks settled all around the coastline of Asia Minor, and even in the center there, Cappadocia, which is a UN heritage site because of its caves and icons. Greeks came from Asia Minor at this time because around 1908 there was a change in the Turkish constitution which would allow Greeks to serve in the military. Now that was a double-edged sword for the Greeks. Oftentimes the Greeks would, like in a Roach Motel, go into the military and would never be heard again. The Turks would like to use the Greeks for their labor gangs, and also when they were fighting the Greeks and other Christian countries. And you can see here Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia were among them who were engaged with in the wars, two wars, in 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars against Ottoman Turkey. The Turks would often place the Christians in the front lines so that, in effect, you would have Christians shooting Christians. So many Greeks in 1912, 1913 flooded to this area to escape that onerous military service. There were at that time Greeks who were already settled in Maslin who returned to Greece, but in general the net result was a gain in population for the local community. Now the fourth stage of the development of the Greek community in Maslin was the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The seas became quite dangerous at this time, and U-boats were sinking ocean liners, and probably the most famous is the Lusitania, which was sunk in May 1915. And as more and more countries entered the war, their transatlantic steamers were converted for war service. They were made into warships, troop carriers, hospital ships, and cargo vessels, so that there were very few ships available for passage back to Greece. And at the same time, the economy in America was booming, as America profited from the war in Europe prior to its entrance into the war in 1917. And this particularly affected the steel industry, which produced many war products, and so it very much suited the economy here. Now, while many Greeks volunteered for service in the American military, many others profited from the availability of jobs because of the booming industry. Not only was the industry booming, but a number of Americans who had worked in the mills volunteered or were drafted into the military service, so the jobs were even greater. And at this time, even after the seas became safe and Greeks were allowed to return home, many of them had reconsidered their choice of staying in America short term and began to return to Greece, marry Greek women, bring them back to Maslin, and establish families. Now that brings us to the fifth stage, the last stage of the early development of the community, and that is the establishment of the Greek church. And this is the church in 1953, 20 years after the establishment of the community in April 1931. And you can see it squeezed between a couple houses at that time. The church is still in operation. It's still used by the community. And so it was a very good investment on their part. The maturity of a Greek community is generally marked by the establishment of a Greek church. Now, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, developed very differently in America than the Catholic Church. In the case of the Catholic Church, the church followed the flag, so that wherever there was settlement, the church was right behind them. The Greeks did not operate that way. Instead, the development of the church was not from the top down, but from the bottom up, and that local communities created the churches. In the early days, because there were no women, there was very little need for priests or church for baptisms and for marriages. Funerals were a different matter, and here's just an example of a funeral with an open coffin. The open coffin was so that a photo of the funeral could be sent home to the loved ones in the family of the deceased. And as you can see here, it is completely male. There are no women. And while there were no elderly who were permitted into the country and who would die of old age here, Greeks were susceptible to accidents, to industrial accidents, and to illnesses connected with their squalid living conditions, and also the unsafe working conditions in the mills. Once a community achieved a certain size and prosperity, and in other words, when it could pay for the services of a resident priest, it established a parish. The priest was absolutely critical for the administering of sacraments, baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and they also presided at the major feast days, the most important being Easter, but also Christmas, Epiphany, Annunciation in March, and the major feast days of the saints. Maslin profited early on by its proximity to other Greek churches in Northeast Ohio. The closest being the two churches in Canton and the church in Akron. While this was a convenient arrangement for the Maslin Greeks, it delayed the establishment of the Greek church in Maslin. And Maslin was the 10th and last community in Northeast Ohio to establish a Greek church. It was preceded by ones in Cleveland, two in Canton, two in Youngstown, Warren, Lorain, and even Mansfield. Now here's a photo of a 1927 wedding that was conducted by the second from the left, Father Joaquin Dulguerakis, who was priest at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Canton. And this is what the normal relation, the setup was, is that you would, if you had a wedding or a funeral, you would bring a priest in, pay for his services, pay for his transportation, and that would be the extent of the presence of the church. Here's a portrait photo of Father Demosthenes Chiamardis, and he started his life in America as a barber in Brockton, Massachusetts. He's widely thought to be the first Greek Orthodox priest ordained in America, and he was ordained in Brooklyn in 1918 by the Syrian Orthodox Church, because at the time the Greeks did not have a hierarchy in this country. He came to Maslin in April 1931, only stayed for 2 months, but it was right at Easter, which is the biggest holiday of the Greek church. And he stayed for but 2 months, but it was enough to get the church established. And with time, the community began to produce its own clerics. And this is Father, or actually at the time he was just a seminarian, Nicholas T. Stavrakis, who was born and raised in Maslin and attended the Greek Orthodox Seminary and was ordained in Canton in 1953. And so what we have is the community going full circle from first relying on the priests from elsewhere to perform the services in Maslin. We have in 1957 Father Stavrakis serving temporarily in Maslin at the wedding of James and Beth Gatchis. Now, the story of Father Father Stavrakis is one of many stories of the Greek priest who served the community. This is another priest, Father Helios Saousis, who served in Maslin in 1937 and later, rather tragically, on a visit to the hospital to administer the last rites to a failing parishioner, had a heart attack. And so instead they had a double funeral in Omaha. And here's another of the early priests. He served in Maslin in 1932, Father Glavas, who became rather famous nationally because he administered to the passengers on a sinking transatlantic steamer in the 19-teens and essentially saved the day because the passengers were about to mutiny. He later on, unfortunately, was murdered in Chicago in 1948. Another of the early priests who served in Maslin from 1939 to 1945 was Father Constantine Papadimitriou. And during his entire 6.5 years here in Maslin, he was without his family. They were cut off from him by World War II, and he was not reunited with his family until he went to his next assignment in Moline, Illinois. Probably the most important of the early priests in Maslin was Father Joaquin Dulguerakis. This is an early photograph of him. He served in Canton, as we saw earlier, from 1915 to 1928. It was his first assignment in America, and his last assignment was coincidentally here in Maslin, where he served from 1952 until 1957, when he returned to Greece and died the next year. He was the priest here when the church was built in 1953. Well, this is just a few of the many, many stories that I could tell about the Greek community and the Greek church, but because of time constraints, we'll have to leave that for another day. Thank you very much.
Sharing a big family moment, working hard from home, relaxing with a friend. Welcome to life, engaged, where reliable internet has never been more important. MCTV extends your family's reach with consistent speeds and whole home Wi-Fi, making life at home engaged, no matter what's thrown your way. MCTV, we go the extra smile.